As my cheating wife's affair partner descended the stairs, his cocky smirk still plastered on his face, I stood waiting in the shadows, fists clenched with a fury I could no longer contain. He was completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, until the moment my fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling across the floor. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his groan and my wife's gasp from the top of the stairs. This was the moment I decided enough was enough. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The cold November wind swept across the quiet suburban streets of Pennsylvania, rattling the bare branches of trees and whipping through the tightly packed homes. Inside one of these homes, Jim Fox sat alone in his garage, nursing a beer and staring at the tool rack he'd carefully assembled over the years. The space had once been his retreat, a place of peace and productivity. Now it was his sanctuary from a life that seemed to be unraveling. The air was heavy with unspoken words and broken trust, an unshakable tension filling the house he had worked so hard to build. Jim was a man who valued stability. A devoted husband and father, he had spent 2 decades striving to provide a comfortable life for his family. Yet, as he stared at his hands, roughened by years of labor, he couldn't help but feel that his efforts had been for nothing. Recent events had shaken him to his core. His wife, Helen, the woman he once trusted implicitly, had betrayed him. Her affair with Frank, a coworker from her job at Home Depot, was more than a fleeting indiscretion. It was a calculated betrayal, one that Jim had discovered in the most humiliating way possible. Helen, though racked with guilt, had her own justifications. She told herself she deserved something more and escape from the monotony of her life. But her attempts to rationalize her actions only deepened the chasm between her and Jim. While Helen wrestled with her guilt, she remained unwilling to take full responsibility, clinging to the idea that her actions could somehow be excused. Their daughter, Emily, was caught in the middle of this maelstrom. A bright and ambitious high school senior, she always admired her father's unwavering dedication and her mother's strength. But now, Emily found herself grappling with loyalty and guilt. She had known about the affair and chosen to stay silent, hoping to preserve the fragile illusion of family stability until she graduated. That choice, however, came at a cost. Every day she watched her father retreat further into himself, the weight of his disappointment and hurt evident in his eyes. And then there was Frank, the man at the center of it all. Smug, arrogant, and utterly unapologetic, he saw Jim as little more than an obstacle. Frank's presence was a constant reminder of Helen's betrayal, his cocky demeanor and casual disregard for the damage he'd caused fueling Jim's simmering anger. As the icy winds of Pennsylvania hinted at the harsh winter ahead, Jim's company offered him an unexpected lifeline, a promotion to maintenance supervisor at a new plant in Daytona Beach, Florida. The position came with a generous pay increase and the promise of a fresh start. For Jim, it was an opportunity to leave behind the painful memories and rebuild his life on his own terms. The offer couldn't have come at a better time. But leaving Pennsylvania wasn't just about escaping the cold or the betrayal. It was about reclaiming his self-respect and forging a new path. The transition promised challenges of its own, including unresolved tensions with Helen and Emily. Yet, as Jim packed his belongings and prepared for the move, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of a journey one marked by loss, betrayal, and the hope of rediscovery. Unbeknownst to Jim, the storm he was leaving behind in Pennsylvania would follow him, threatening to disrupt the fragile peace he sought in the warmth of Florida's sunlit shores. The late afternoon sun hung low in the Pennsylvania sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the Best Western Motel. Jim Fox tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he stared at the crimson Camry parked a few spaces away. It was unmistakably Helen's car, its dented front grille, a dead giveaway. His heart pounded, a mix of disbelief and dread coursing through him. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the gnawing suspicion that had been building for weeks now felt undeniable. Steeling himself, Jim parked his company car, a sleek sedan with tinted windows, in the far corner of the lot, out of sight. For a long moment, he simply sat there, his mind racing. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps Helen had car trouble and pulled in here for assistance. Yet the possibility felt increasingly remote as he considered her recent behavior, late nights at work, vague explanations, and a certain emotional distance that hadn't been there before. Finally, Jim decided to act. He grabbed the jackknife from his glove compartment, exited his car, and walked briskly toward the Camry. With a swift, practiced motion, he punctured the valve stem of the rear tire, ensuring it would deflate. If Helen was inside the motel with someone, she'd have to call him for help. Maybe then he could confront her directly. Returning to his car, he slouched low in the driver's seat and waited. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Just as Jim began to doubt his decision, movement near the motel's entrance caught his eye. Helen emerged, her hair slightly disheveled, alongside a man Jim immediately recognized from her workplace, Frank. The two laughed as they walked toward the Camry, Frank's arm draped casually around Helen's shoulders. Jim's chest tightened as a wave of anger and betrayal surged through him. So it's true, he thought bitterly. He watched as Helen discovered the flat tire and cursed loudly, her frustration evident. Jim cracked the window just enough to catch their conversation. "Damn it, I don't have a spare," Helen said, exasperated. "No problem," Frank replied with a smirk. "Let's head back to our room while I call for help." Jim clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as Frank's smug tone grated on his nerves. The casual intimacy between them was a knife to his heart, each word confirming what he'd hoped wasn't true. But before they could retreat, another car pulled into the lot. Jim's stomach dropped as he recognized the familiar silver Honda Civic Emily's car. Jim froze, his mind reeling. What is she doing here? He watched as his daughter stepped out, her face a mask of irritation. She approached Helen and Frank, and though Jim couldn't hear every word, the exchange was tense. Moments later, Emily opened her trunk and retrieved the spare tire Jim had left there just days ago. As Frank leaned down to carry the tire, Emily turned to Helen with a scathing remark that carried clearly through the still air. "If you were really thinking about me, Mom, you'd put on some clothes before I got here." Helen flushed with embarrassment as Frank chuckled, but Emily's cold demeanor didn't waver. "Keep him away from Dad," she added sharply. "Dad might not know yet, but if Frank pushes him, I guarantee he'll figure it out." Jim's heart sank as the weight of Emily's words hit him. She knew. She's known all along. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. His wife's infidelity was devastating enough, but the realization that his daughter had been complicit shattered him. The strong, reliable bond he believed he shared with Emily now felt tainted by her silence. As Helen and Frank drove off, Jim remained motionless in his car, staring blankly at the now empty parking lot. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger at Helen's betrayal, disgust toward Frank's audacity, and profound sorrow for the fracture in his relationship with Emily. He finally started the engine, the low hum of the car doing little to drown out the chaos in his mind. A part of him wanted to storm home and demand answers, to confront Helen and Emily and lay bare the pain they had caused. But another part of him, the part worn down by years of striving to be the calm, steady presence in his family, knew it wasn't the time. As he drove back, the November twilight enveloping the town, Jim resolved to face the situation head-on. This was just the beginning. The storm that had been brewing in his life wasn't over, and he would need every ounce of strength to weather it. The spare tire rattled lightly in the trunk as Emily pulled into the motel parking lot, her jaw clenched in frustration. She had received a hurried call from Helen just minutes earlier asking for help. Helen's explanation was vague: a flat tire. She needed Emily's spare, and it had to be quick. Something in her mother's voice had unsettled her, a note of urgency that didn't feel genuine. Still, Emily came. She always came. Stepping out of her car, Emily spotted her mother standing awkwardly beside her Camry, Frank lingering nearby. The sight of them together turned her stomach. Frank's overfamiliar posture, the faint smirk on his face, everything about him screamed disrespect. Not only toward her father, but toward Emily herself. Her love for Jim and the guilt she carried for her silence collided in that moment, twisting painfully in her chest. "Here," Emily said tersely, popping the trunk and retrieving the tire. She glanced at Helen, her gaze sharp. "Do you want to tell me why you're here? Or should I just guess?" Helen flushed but didn't respond immediately, her usual quick wit faltering under Emily's pointed tone. Frank stepped in, his voice annoyingly smooth. "Don't worry, Emily, I've got it. Your mom's been under a lot of stress lately. It's just a flat tire." Emily cut him off with a cold glare. "I wasn't talking to you." The air between mother and daughter grew heavy. Helen finally reached out, a weak smile on her face. "Emily, sweetheart, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't," Emily snapped, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "Don't insult me by pretending this is innocent. Do you think Dad's that clueless? Or do you just think he doesn't matter?" Helen flinched, the words landing harder than Emily intended. Frank shifted uncomfortably, stepping back with the tire, but Emily wasn't finished. She turned to her mother, her voice low but seething. "If you cared about Dad even a little, you wouldn't be here. And you wouldn't have dragged me into this." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but Emily shook her head and turned toward her car. "I'll tell you one thing," she added over her shoulder. "If you're not thinking about Dad, you should be. Because one day he's going to figure it out. And when he does, don't expect me to clean up the mess." As she drove away, tears blurred Emily's vision. Her love for her father burned fiercely, but so did her anger at her mother and the guilt she felt for keeping such a painful secret. She hated herself for it, but more than anything, she hated how trapped she felt between the two people she loved most. How did it come to this? Jim Fox stared at the folder in front of him, the bold letters Daytona Beach Project printed on its cover. His supervisor's voice played in his mind on repeat. This is a significant opportunity, Jim. A fresh start, a promotion and a raise. We're counting on you. The offer seemed to have come out of nowhere, and yet it was exactly what he needed, a chance to escape the wreckage of his life in Pennsylvania. For weeks, Jim had been suffocating under the weight of betrayal. Helen's affair and Emily's complicity had left him reeling, unsure of his place in the family he had worked so hard to provide for. This promotion felt like a lifeline, a way to reclaim control over his future. By moving to Florida, he could leave behind the pain, the lies, and the suffocating memories of what his home had become. After a restless night of deliberation, Jim signed the papers and prepared to break the news. At breakfast the next morning, Jim cleared his throat, drawing Helen and Emily's attention. The tension in the room was palpable. "I've been offered a promotion," he began, his voice steady but detached. "It's a maintenance supervisor role in Daytona Beach. I'll be moving there next week." Helen's fork clattered onto her plate, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. "Daytona Beach? That's next week? Jim, this is so sudden." "It's an opportunity I can't pass up," he replied curtly, avoiding her gaze. "It's a good move for me, and honestly, I think some space would do us all good." Emily looked down at her plate, guilt shadowing her features. "What about us?" she asked softly. "Are we supposed to stay here without you?" "You'll finish school here, Emily," Jim said, his tone softening slightly. "I'll come back when I can. But this is something I need to do for myself." Helen opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. The words died on her lips as she saw the finality in Jim's eyes. For the first time, she realized just how deeply she had wounded him. Thanksgiving arrived with a chill in the air, both outside and within the Fox household. Jim had made it clear he wasn't interested in hosting a grand dinner, but Helen insisted. She said it would be good for the family, a chance to reconnect. What she didn't mention was that she had invited Frank and his wife, Nancy, claiming it was an innocent gesture to foster goodwill among friends. Jim's stomach churned as Frank and Nancy walked through the door. Frank, clad in a Dallas Cowboys sweater, greeted everyone with his trademark smirk. Jim forced himself to remain civil, though the sight of Frank in his home made his blood boil. The tension in the room was thick, but Helen's forced cheerfulness kept the conversation flowing. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Frank's comments became more pointed, his tone laced with condescension. "You've got a nice setup here, Jim," he remarked, leaning back in his chair. "Must be hard leaving all this behind for Florida." Jim tightened his grip on his fork but said nothing. Helen shot Frank a warning glance, but he ignored it, continuing. "I've been to Daytona Beach a few times. Great for retirees, but I don't know if it's your speed." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between her father and Frank. "Dad's going there for work," she said, her voice tinged with defiance. "It's a big opportunity." Frank chuckled. Of course. I'm just saying it's a big change. Hopefully the sunshine will do you some good." The snide remark was the final straw. Jim slammed his fork onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Frank," he said, his voice low and cold, "you've been in my house for less than an hour, and I've had just about enough of your nonsense. If you can't behave with respect, then get out." The room fell silent. Frank's smirk faltered for a moment before he stood, feigning indignation. "Relax, Jim. It was just a joke." "It wasn't funny," Jim snapped, rising to his feet. "And it's not the first time you've disrespected me under my own roof." Helen jumped up, her voice trembling. "Jim, please, let's not do this here. It's Thanksgiving." But Jim had reached his limit. He looked at Frank, his gaze unwavering. "Get out," he repeated. Frank hesitated, glancing at Helen for support, but she looked away, her face pale. Finally, he scoffed and muttered, "Fine. I was leaving anyway." He grabbed his coat, Nancy trailing behind him, and left without another word. The door slammed shut, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Jim turned to Helen, his voice quieter but no less firm. "You knew what you were doing when you invited him here. Don't pretend you didn't." Helen stammered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I thought maybe it would make things better. I didn't want." "Stop," Jim said, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it. This was my last Thanksgiving here. I'm leaving, and I'm not looking back." Without waiting for a response, Jim grabbed his coat and walked out into the cold night. As he drove away, the weight of the evening lifted slightly, replaced by a grim sense of determination. Florida was waiting, and with it, a chance to rebuild his life. For the first time in weeks, Jim felt a flicker of hope. This was the beginning of something new. The sun hung high over Daytona Beach, casting a golden glow on the sandy coastline and palm trees swaying in the warm breeze. Jim Fox stepped out of his pickup truck, the weight of his belongings reduced to a few suitcases and a box of tools. His new apartment was modest but clean, tucked within a quiet condominium complex not far from the ocean. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the faint scent of fresh paint greeted him. The space was sparsely furnished, just a couch, a table, and a bed, but it was enough. It was a start. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling into his new role as maintenance supervisor at the plant. The work was familiar, and Jim found comfort in the steady rhythm of his tasks. His team respected him, and his boss seemed pleased with his performance. Yet, when the workday ended, Jim often found himself sitting alone on his balcony, gazing at the horizon as the sun dipped into the Atlantic. The quiet was both soothing and unsettling. For the first time in years, there were no arguments to navigate, no family dinners to attend, no shared laughter echoing through the walls. The emptiness gnawed at him, a stark reminder of all he had lost. The condo complex was bustling with activity, a mix of retirees, young professionals, and a surprising number of widows and divorcees. Jim quickly gained a reputation as the helpful new neighbor. Word spread that he was handy with tools, and soon enough, he was fielding requests to fix leaky faucets, squeaky doors, and broken shelves. The gratitude of his neighbors was always evident: plates of cookies, bottles of wine, or simple words of thanks left at his door. Despite the gestures, Jim still felt like an outsider, navigating a world that seemed both inviting and unfamiliar. It was during one of these repair jobs that Jim met Susan Struthers. She was in her mid-40s with striking auburn hair and a confident smile that seemed to brighten the room. Her request was simple. Her closet door had come off its track. Jim arrived with his toolkit in hand, expecting a quick fix, but Susan lingered, striking up conversation as he worked. She asked about his move, his job, and how he was settling in. There was a warmth to her that caught Jim off guard, a stark contrast to the guarded tension he had grown used to with Helen. As Jim finished the repair, Susan handed him a glass of iced tea and gestured for him to sit. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked, her tone casual but curious. "Yeah," Jim replied, taking a sip. "Moved down from Pennsylvania a few weeks ago. Needed a change." Susan tilted her head, studying him. "That's a big change," she said. "Florida's a good place for fresh starts, though. What brought you down here, if you don't mind me asking?" Jim hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, he settled on a simple truth: work. And, well, I guess I needed to get away from some things. Susan nodded knowingly. "I get that. Sometimes distance is the only way to figure things out." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time in weeks, Jim felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more frequently. Susan invited him to community gatherings, introduced him to her friends, and often stopped by to chat. She was direct but kind, her humor sharp without being cruel. Unlike Helen, there was no pretense, no games. Susan seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Jim, and that simplicity was refreshing. Despite her warmth, Jim found himself holding back. His betrayal by Helen had left deep scars, and the idea of trusting someone again felt like a risk he wasn't ready to take. At night, as he lay in bed, he wrestled with conflicting emotions. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind, but it was also lonely. He missed the routine of family life, even if it had been fractured. Yet, he reminded himself, loneliness was a small price to pay for peace. One evening, after a long day at work, Jim returned home to find a bottle of wine and a note on his doorstep. It was from Susan. "Thanks for fixing the cabinet. Thought you might enjoy this. Let me know if you'd like company to share it." Jim chuckled softly, the gesture both thoughtful and bold. He placed the wine on the counter, debating whether to take her up on the offer. The thought of companionship was tempting, but part of him hesitated. Was he ready to let someone in? The days turned into weeks, and Jim began to find a rhythm in his new life. The warmth of the Florida sun, the sound of waves crashing on the shore, and the occasional visits from neighbors like Susan slowly began to fill the void. Yet in quieter moments, the memories of Helen and Emily lingered. He wondered how they were coping, whether they missed him, and if they regretted the choices that had driven him away. Susan's presence became a subtle but steady comfort, her kindness a reminder that life could still hold moments of joy even after heartbreak. She didn't push or pry, but her laughter and warmth began to chip away at the walls Jim had built around himself. Slowly, he started to see the possibility of moving forward, not as a way to erase the past, but as a way to build something new. As he sat on his balcony one evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, Jim realized he was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. Perhaps, just perhaps, Florida wasn't just a fresh start, it was a second chance. The atmosphere at the Home Depot store where Helen worked had always been cordial, even bustling with camaraderie during busy seasons. But now, every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a knife twisting in her back. The rumors had started small, a few side comments about Frank's frequent absences and his flirtations. Then came the devastating revelation: Frank had contracted an STI, and the implications were impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before Helen's name became entangled in the gossip. Employees speculated openly, some even pointing fingers as she passed. One day, while unloading stock in the break room, Helen overheard two younger cashiers whispering, "Can you believe it? Frank hooked up with her, and now look what happened." Ugh, I'd be mortified. She must think no one notices. Helen froze, the box she was holding slipping from her grip. The sharp thud silenced the whispers, and the two women quickly left, their eyes darting anywhere but at her. Helen remained there for a moment, breathing heavily, the humiliation settling over her like a suffocating weight. At home, the isolation was worse. Calls from friends dwindled, and visits from neighbors became rare. Even Emily, who had been a source of support, seemed distant. Helen knew her daughter was struggling to reconcile her feelings, torn between love for her father and pity for her mother. Emily spent more and more time away, leaving Helen to stew in the silence of her own thoughts. One evening, as she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched dinner in front of her, Helen finally allowed herself to confront the truth. She had done this. Her choices, the affair, the lies, the betrayal had led to this moment. For months, she had tried to rationalize her actions, telling herself she deserved a break, a moment of excitement after years of monotony. But now, faced with the wreckage of her life, those justifications rang hollow. Her mind drifted to Jim, and a pang of guilt surged through her. She had taken for granted his quiet strength, his unwavering support. She had hurt him in ways she hadn't fully grasped at the time. The realization hit her like a wave. She didn't just miss him, she missed who she had been when she was with him. The decision to reach out to Jim wasn't easy. Helen knew she couldn't undo the past, but the thought of leaving things as they were felt unbearable. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, Helen picked up her phone and dialed his number. The line rang several times before going to voicemail. She hesitated, then left a message. "Jim, it's Helen. I don't even know if you'll listen to this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I see now how much I hurt you. And I miss you. I miss us. Please, call me back if you can." She hung up, her hands trembling. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, the tears coming in heavy, uncontrollable waves. Days turned into weeks, and Jim didn't respond. Helen busied herself with work, avoiding eye contact with her coworkers, and trying to ignore the sting of whispered conversations. But the weight of her loneliness grew unbearable. One evening, Emily returned home to find her mother packing a suitcase. "Mom, what's going on?" Emily asked, her voice cautious. Helen sighed, pausing to sit on the edge of the bed. "I need a fresh start, Emily. I can't stay here anymore. Everything reminds me of what I've lost. I'm thinking of moving to Florida, to be closer to you and to your father." Emily frowned. "Mom, I don't think Dad wants." "I know," Helen interrupted, her voice trembling. "I know he doesn't want me back, but I need to try. I need to fix things with him, with you, with myself. Staying here isn't helping anyone." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "If that's what you think is best." When Helen arrived in Daytona Beach, she felt a mix of hope and dread. The city was vibrant, the warm air and bright sunshine a stark contrast to the dreary cold she had left behind. She rented a small apartment not far from Jim's complex, careful not to intrude directly into his life. Her goal was simple: to prove slowly and quietly that she was serious about change. Reaching out to Jim again was harder than she had expected. Her first attempts were tentative, a quick text to let him know she was nearby, a voicemail asking if he'd like to meet for coffee. Weeks passed with no response. But Helen didn't give up. She found a job at a local store, began attending community events, and even reached out to some of Jim's neighbors, hoping they might relay her efforts. One evening, she saw him at a local diner, seated alone at a corner table. Summoning her courage, Helen approached, her heart pounding. "Jim," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "Can I sit?" Jim looked up, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he gestured to the empty chair. Helen sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I'm not here to make excuses," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed to see you. To tell you that I'm trying to be better, for Emily, for myself, and maybe one day for you." Jim studied her, his face giving nothing away. Finally, He nodded. It's going to take more than words, Helen. I know, she replied, tears welling in her eyes, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. For the first time, Jim didn't turn her away. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for Helen, that was enough. Emily stepped off the plane in Daytona Beach, the warm coastal breeze immediately brushing against her skin. The Florida sunshine contrasted starkly with the gray skies of Pennsylvania she had left behind, but it did little to soothe the anxious knot in her stomach. This wasn't just a visit to see her father, it was a mission to mend the fragile relationship she had fractured through her silence and complicity. As she rolled her suitcase out of the terminal, she rehearsed the words she'd been preparing for weeks, hoping they would be enough. Jim was waiting outside in his truck, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was cautious. When he spotted Emily, he offered a small nod. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice steady but distant. Hi, Dad, Emily replied, her voice soft. She approached him, hesitating briefly before wrapping her arms around him. For a moment, he stiffened, but then he returned the hug, albeit briefly. It was a start, she told herself as they climbed into the truck. The drive to Jim's apartment was quiet, punctuated only by casual remarks about the weather and the city. Emily stole glances at her father, noticing the changes in him. He seemed calmer but also guarded, as if he built walls around himself that even she might not be able to breach. That evening, after dinner on the balcony overlooking the ocean, Emily finally mustered the courage to say what had been weighing on her. Dad, I need to talk to you, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Jim didn't respond immediately but gestured for her to continue. I owe you an apology, she said, her eyes welling with tears, for keeping Mom's secret, for not telling you when I should have. I thought I was protecting the family, but all I did was hurt you. And I'm so sorry. Jim leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He let her words hang in the air for a moment before speaking. Emily, I've thought about that a lot, he admitted. What hurt wasn't just what your mom did, it was knowing you were part of it. I felt like I couldn't trust either of you anymore. Emily nodded, tears spilling over. I know, I can't imagine how much that must have hurt. I've hated myself for it every day since. Jim sighed, his expression softening slightly. You're my daughter, Emily. No matter what happened, I'll always love you. But trust takes time to rebuild. Later that night, as they sat together on the couch, Emily hesitated before pulling out an old photo she brought with her. It was of the two of them at a summer fair when she was 8, Jim holding a giant stuffed bear he'd won for her. She smiled through her tears as she handed it to him. Do you remember this? She asked. You spent $20 on that game just so I could have that bear. I still have it, you know. Jim's face softened as he looked at the photo. I remember, he said quietly. You wouldn't stop talking about how you wanted to win that bear, so I figured I'd make it happen. That's the dad I remember, Emily said, her voice trembling. The one who would do anything for me. I want to be that daughter again, the one who deserves a dad like you. Jim's throat tightened as he looked at her. Slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. You're still that daughter, Emily, he said. You made a mistake, but we all do. What matters is what you do now. Emily nodded, her tears flowing freely. I'll never betray you again, Dad, I promise. Over the next few days, Emily made a conscious effort to support her father. She helped him with small tasks around the apartment, joined him for walks on the beach, and even accompanied him to a community event where his neighbors warmly welcomed her. She saw glimpses of the life he was building, peaceful, stable, and far removed from the chaos they'd left behind. Before she returned home, Emily stood with Jim on the balcony, watching the waves crash against the shore. Thank you for letting me come, Dad, she said. I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust again, but I'm going to do everything I can. Jim turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in months. You're my daughter, Emily. You've always had my love. The trust will work on it. Together. As they hugged, the knot in Emily's stomach loosened, replaced by a flicker of hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like they were moving in the right direction together. Helen stood in the small kitchen of her Daytona Beach apartment, the aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread filling the air. She had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing the meal, hoping it might bridge the growing chasm between her and Jim. It wasn't much just dinner, but it was one of the few tangible ways she could show her willingness to make amends. When Jim arrived, his expression was guarded but polite. Smells good, he said, setting his keys on the counter. Thanks, Helen replied, offering a tentative smile. I thought it might be nice to have a quiet dinner. Just the two of us. Jim nodded and sat down, the tension between them palpable. As they ate, Helen made an effort to keep the conversation light, asking about his work and new neighbors. Jim answered with short, measured responses, his tone polite but distant. It was a stark reminder of how far they still had to go. Later that week, Helen found herself watching Jim from her balcony as he chatted with Susan Struthers by the pool. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the laughter and ease between them stirred an uncomfortable mix of emotions. Helen had no right to feel jealous, she knew that, but the pang of insecurity and guilt was impossible to ignore. She had betrayed him, and yet here she was, consumed by the fear that someone else might now hold his attention. The thought of losing him completely felt unbearable. Determined to take action, Helen decided to confront her feelings directly. That evening, as Jim returned home, Helen met him at the door. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jim sighed, sensing the weight of her request. "What's on your mind?" Helen gestured toward the living room, and they sat down. She clasped her hands tightly, struggling to find the right words. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I see you talking to other women, and it makes me feel insecure." Jim raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "Helen, you don't get to feel insecure about that. Not after what happened." "I know," Helen said quickly, her voice breaking. "I know I have no right, but I can't help it. I'm trying, Jim. I'm trying to show you that I've changed, but seeing you with them makes me feel like I've already lost you." Jim leaned back, his expression weary. "Helen, you made your choices. I'm here because I care about Emily, and I'm willing to give you a chance to prove that you've changed. But trust, that's going to take time. You don't get to control who I talk to or what I do." Helen nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I don't want to control you. I want you to see that I'm serious about fixing this." A few nights later, Helen approached Jim again, this time with a different approach. She sat beside him on the couch, her voice soft. "I miss being close to you, not just emotionally, but physically. I know I have no right to ask, but could we try?" Jim hesitated, studying her carefully. "Helen, intimacy isn't a solution. It doesn't fix trust or erase what happened." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's a step. Please, Jim, just give me this chance." After a long pause, Jim nodded reluctantly. Their physical reconnection was hesitant and laden with unspoken tension. For Helen, it was a fragile glimmer of hope, a sign that she might be able to rebuild what she had shattered. For Jim, it was a reminder of how much healing still lay ahead. And yet, for both of them, it was a start, however uncertain. The sun had barely set when Jim heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots stomping up the walkway to his apartment. The knock that followed was loud and aggressive, reverberating through the quiet space. Jim, who had been sorting through a toolbox in the living room, froze momentarily. He didn't need to open the door to know who it was. Frank. Taking a deep breath, Jim stood, his movements deliberate. He opened the door to find Frank standing there, his posture rigid and his face a mask of barely restrained anger. Dressed in a cheap button-down shirt and worn jeans, Frank looked far less confident than usual, though his scowl carried the bravado of someone spoiling for a fight. "We need to talk," Frank barked, stepping forward as if to force his way inside. Jim didn't move, his tall frame blocking the doorway with quiet authority. "You've got about 2 minutes," Jim said calmly, his voice firm but controlled. "Make it count." Frank's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" He spat. "Walking away from everything like you're some kind of saint. Helen, Emily, the whole damn us, like none of it's your fault." Jim's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "This isn't about being better than you, Frank. It's about moving on. Something you should try." "Moving on?" Frank laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and forced. "Is that what you call it? Running away to Florida, acting like your hands are clean." Jim crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "I didn't come here to argue with you. If you've got something to say, say it." Frank stepped closer, his face inches from Jim's. "You think you can just take Helen and Emily and leave me in the dust? After everything, you think you can just shut the door on me?" Jim's eyes hardened. "Helen isn't mine to take, and you've never had a place in my life or my family. You made sure of that when you crossed the line." The tension crackled between them, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Frank's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, Jim thought he might swing. But instead, Frank's voice dropped, laced with venom. "You don't scare me, Jim." Jim didn't flinch. "Good. Then we're clear. Now leave." Frank, unable to hold back any longer, shoved Jim hard in the chest. Jim stumbled slightly but quickly regained his footing, his face calm even as his muscles tensed. "Don't do that again," he said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet warning. Frank didn't heed it. He lunged again, this time with a clumsy punch aimed at Jim's jaw. Jim sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Frank's arm and twisting it behind his back. "You're not going to win this, Frank," Jim said, his voice steady but firm. "Not here, not now, and not like this." Frank struggled, cursing under his breath, but Jim's grip was unyielding. After a few moments, Jim released him and stepped back, keeping his stance defensive. "Go home, Frank," he said. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." Frank glared at him, his face red with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," he growled. Jim sighed, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "It is for me. You're not worth the fight." As Frank stormed off, Jim watched him go, a strange mix of relief and finality settling over him. He closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had faced Frank's anger head-on and emerged unshaken. For the first time, he felt like he had truly severed the ties binding him to the chaos of his past. That night, Jim packed a small bag and left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short and to the point. "Helen, I need some space. Don't follow me. I'll call when I'm ready." He didn't feel the need to explain further. This wasn't about punishing her or Emily, it was about reclaiming his peace. Jim drove for hours, the Florida coastline stretching out endlessly beside him. The moonlit waves mirrored the clarity he felt in his own mind. For too long, he had been caught in a web of betrayal and resentment, but tonight, he had chosen a different path. He eventually pulled into a small, quiet beach town and checked into a modest motel. Sitting on the sand just before dawn, he watched as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. The sky was a brilliant mix of orange and pink, a vivid reminder of the beauty that could come after even the darkest night. For Jim, this wasn't just a new day. It was a new beginning. The past was behind him now, and the future, whatever it held, was his to shape. The Florida sun bathed Jim's modest apartment in a warm, golden glow as he stood on the balcony, sipping his coffee and watching the waves roll in. The rhythmic crash of the ocean had become a source of solace for him, a reminder that life, like the tide, ebbed and flowed. Months had passed since his climactic confrontation with Frank and the emotional turmoil of leaving his fractured family behind. Now Jim was embracing a new chapter, one defined by self-respect and the quiet satisfaction of rediscovering himself. In this fresh start, Jim focused on personal growth. He took up swimming in the mornings, finding it both invigorating and meditative. At work, he had gained the respect of his team, earning praise for his leadership and dedication. His neighbors at the condominium often sought his advice or help with repairs, offering baked goods or heartfelt thanks in return. While these small acts didn't fill the void left by his broken marriage, they reminded him of his value as a person beyond the roles of husband and father. Emily's visits to Florida became more frequent, and with each one, their bond grew stronger. During spring break, she sat with Jim by the pool, her voice thoughtful. "Dad, I've been thinking," she began. "After I graduate, I want to move here, be closer to you, maybe even start college nearby." Jim's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. "You're always welcome here, Emily," he said, his voice steady but warm. "This is your home as much as mine." Living together brought them closer than they had been in years. They spent evenings cooking dinner, walking on the beach, and sharing stories. Emily often sought his advice, confiding in him about her fears and aspirations. She saw a side of her father that she had overlooked before, a man who, despite everything, remained kind, steady, and full of quiet wisdom. For Jim, Emily's presence was a reminder that, despite the pain of the past, there were still parts of his life worth cherishing. Meanwhile, Helen continued to wrestle with the consequences of her choices. She had settled into her own apartment in Daytona Beach, not far from Jim's, and had started rebuilding her life. But the weight of her mistakes was ever present. Her attempts to reconnect with Jim were met with polite but firm boundaries, a clear indication that trust was still a long way off. One afternoon, Helen approached Jim after running into him at the local grocery store. "Jim," she began hesitantly, "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry. I wish I could undo everything." Jim regarded her for a moment, his expression calm but unreadable. "Helen, I've forgiven you in my own way," he said finally. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. It means I'm letting go of the anger for my sake, not yours." Helen nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just hope that someday you might let me prove I've changed." "We'll see," Jim replied simply, before walking away. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't an invitation either. For Helen, it was a painful but necessary reminder that trust had to be earned, not demanded. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jim stood on the beach, the waves lapping gently at his feet. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking display of nature's resilience and beauty. For the first time in a long while, Jim felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy and there were still unanswered questions, but he was no longer burdened by the weight of the past. As he turned to head back to his apartment, Jim allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Life was far from perfect, but it was his to shape. The future stretched before him like the vast ocean, full of possibilities waiting to be discovered. And this time, he was ready to embrace them. Life has a way of testing the boundaries of our strength and the depth of our self-worth. For Jim, the journey from betrayal to renewal was as much about rediscovering himself as it was about letting go of the weight of his past. His story underscores a fundamental truth. Before expecting respect from others, we must first learn to respect ourselves. At its core, Jim's decision to leave Pennsylvania and start anew in Florida wasn't about escaping the pain, it was about choosing himself. His unwavering resolve to rebuild his life, even when it meant walking away from the familiar, highlighted the courage it takes to prioritize one's well-being. By setting boundaries and refusing to let bitterness define him, Jim found a path to healing that honored both his dignity and his future. Equally poignant was the theme of forgiveness. Forgiveness, as Jim discovered, is a complex and deeply personal process. It is not an obligation, nor is it synonymous with forgetting. Forgiving Helen allowed him to release the anger that threatened to consume him, but it did not erase the scars she left behind. Jim's choice to forgive without reconciling with Helen reflects a profound understanding. Forgiveness is as much for oneself as it is for the other person. Emily's journey mirrored her father's in many ways. Her guilt and complicity in Helen's affair served as a painful but necessary lesson in accountability. By seeking to rebuild trust with Jim, she demonstrated that redemption is possible when accompanied by genuine effort. Together, their repaired bond stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, even in the face of betrayal. Finally, the story embraced the theme of new beginnings. Jim's move to Florida marked more than a geographic change, it symbolized a rebirth, a shedding of the old to make room for the new. From the tranquil mornings by the ocean to the meaningful connections he formed with others, Jim's life became a reminder that it is never too late to start over. As Jim stood on the beach, watching the sunset into the vast horizon, he understood something profound. Life is not defined by the pain we endure, but by the choices we make in its aftermath. With each wave that kissed the shore, he felt the quiet promise of possibility. The future was his to shape, and this time he was ready to embrace it fully.